So the F-111C that we have here at HARS actually started its life as an American Air Force F-111A, and then to replace some of the ones that the Air Force had lost, this came to us and had to be substantially modified, with the wings extended by another 3 feet and a much greater undercarriage capability was added to it to allow it to serve with the RAAF. With the RAAF, the F-111s served for 35 years. It was only Australia and the US which operated this amazingly capability of this aircraft. At HARS, this is the only one that our visitors to a museum can regularly sit in. And this aircraft is actually now owned by our association. In fact, as our president said when he signed off on it recently, it's not every day you get to sign to take ownership of an F-111. For a 1960s design, the F-111 was an amazingly advanced aircraft, not just with its swing wing capability, wings straight out for low speed, sweeping back to allow it to operate up to Mach 2.5, but the ejection system allowed not just pilots to try and bail out, but actually the whole capsule at the front of the aircraft would blast off. It was fitted with rocket motor to allow the capsule then to be taken to a greater height and also to wash off the forward speed. Parachutes would be deployed using the existing closed cabin until they were down to 15,000 feet, then atmospheric cabin, and had buoyancy as well for survival in the ocean. So a remarkable survivability for pilots with the RAAF. This particular aircraft joined the RAAF from America as a replacement for some of the earlier ones that were lost. And it served in Vietnam. So this aircraft has a war service from Vietnam with the US Air Force before it became an RAAF aircraft. The other side of this is it was actually the last operational F-111 in Australia, because the final day of service, a formation flew out from Amberley over Brisbane, came back in and landed. The pilot of this particular aircraft waited for the others to shut down, and 1 minute later he shut the engine on this, the final F-111 to sign off on service after 35 years with the Royal Australian Air Force. Indeed, it was the last operational F-111 in the world, because the US Air Force had ceased operation of these aircraft before Australia, and then we followed suit. So we are literally sitting in aviation history on board this F-111, and our visitors to the museum, as part of their tour, get the opportunity to experience that history by sitting in the cockpit.
At the museum on the day was a former F-111 navigator and weapons systems officer, Phil McDonald, who was involved in the delivery of the first F-111s to Australia. We asked Phil if he wouldn't mind giving us a walk around and tell us about the aircraft.
The aircraft was designed in the early 60s. It was quite a remarkable aircraft for its time. We didn't have digital then, it was all analog, and it had some remarkable features. Didn't fly till 67, but it was the first to have the swing wing. As you can see, the wings back where they are now, they can do 2.5 times the speed of sound. The wings come forward for takeoff, landing, and they can be in any other position for various speed and altitude requirements. It was quite technologically advanced for its time, particularly again that it was all analog. It was the first to have the swing wing. It was the first to have an ejectable capsule. In other words, the whole cockpit ejects instead of going out in the seat, and that was to protect the crew, because at speeds of up to Mach 2.5, 2.5 times the speed of sound, you wouldn't be comfortable going out in the seat, I don't think. So the first have also terrain following radar, and that's where the aircraft can follow the terrain. There's a selection knob on the centre console, 200, 300, 400, 500, 750 or 1,000 feet. So you can select 200 feet and you'd be doing 1,100 kilometres per hour normally, maybe, but up to Mach 1.2 with no hands. So to follow the terrain down through the valleys and over the hills, and that was to avoid radar. In other words, hide behind the hills. There's a great escarpment out here, for instance. One of our targets, simulated targets, was here. And you could hide behind that escarpment They won't pick you up on radar until you pop up to deliver your weapons. So a lot of very first things. The escape capsule, if it landed in water, it has flotation bags. It has a radio, antenna comes up, flotation bags, and so it's all designed to protect the crew. We got ours delivered 24 in 1973, and then later, after we lost a couple, they bought 4 second-hand American F-111As. This is a C. The A's were different in that they had the shorter wing. Australia, because of the long distances we anticipated, wanted the longer wing like the American Navy version, which didn't end up going into production or into service. And the FB-111A, which was the nuclear strike, strategic air command as it was called then, aircraft, it had the longer wing, and there's a lot of fuel in the wing, so it gives you extra range, and it also adds to the weight, so it needed a stronger undercarriage as well. So our F-111Cs had the longer wing of both the F-111B and the FB-111A, and the stronger undercarriage. Okay. Now, as I said before, once we lost a couple, we bought 4 second-hand F-111As with shorter wings, and they actually modified them, extended their wings, put in the stronger undercarriage. You'll see on the undercarriage it says FB-111, and that cost a lot of money. They did 4, and they said, well, we're not going to do that again. And so this is actually one of those second-hand ones. So even though Australia didn't have them in any conflict, they had them in Darwin, I think, ready for Timor and things, this one had, with the Americans, it served in Vietnam. There's a book on it, on aircraft in Vietnam used by the Americans, and this one is listed as having some battle damage, and there's a couple of patches on the side of the aircraft that, from battle damage it received in Vietnam. When we got them back and formed the first squadron, the CEO sat us down, that was 6th Squadron in 1973, and said, these are very controversial. The cost overruns, time delays because of the modifications that were required, a new government in power, that cost $20 million, they'll have to last 20 years. Well, they lasted 37 with upgrades, etc. So it's a magnificent aircraft, and what a privilege it was to be 24-year-old and flying the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world, and delivering not only that, training in America and bringing them back here. So this is 109, as I said, one of the second-hand ones we bought, and here it is to live in HARS. I mentioned the battle damage. I think that's a patch over some of the battle damage. This one, when it was in American service, got in Vietnam. Remarkable thing about these, another first which I didn't mention before, was that it was the first to have turbofan engines, that's jet engines with a small fan, with afterburner, which is the afterburner is what's used for supersonic flight and extra takeoff. So one of the great, we were told when we were in training over there, and when I went to the factory where they were built, the most costly part of the design was this air intake, because you can't have supersonic air going into a turbofan, the fan would stall. So this actually is called a variable inlet spike, and as you go faster it gets fatter. It moves back and gets fatter to reduce the amount of air. Then you've got all those vortex generators to slow the air down so it's not supersonic when it hits the fan. That's very briefly, but at slow speed you actually need more air, sorry. So this cowl is a translating cowl. It moves forward to get more air in when you're going slow. So going very fast we need less air, and going slow we need more. This is the wing carry-through box. This wing will come forward and of course will go out almost out to there. 16 degrees when fully forward, and that's for takeoff, and we have leading edge slats and trailing edge flaps. Back, as soon as you're airborne, they sweep them back to 26 degrees, clean it up, bring in the flaps and slats, and that's also your long-range cruise wing sweep. And then, depending on your speed, the wing sweep can be anywhere from 26 to 72. 72 is where you're going supersonic, 2.5 times the speed of sound, and anything in between. This large door here for the undercarriage also serves, while you're airborne, as a speed brake. So it can be lowered without lowering the wheels to slow the aircraft down, and that sort of thing, okay? Very strong undercarriage, as you'll see. Most of the fuel, well, there's multiple a multitude of fuel tanks, but the wing, belly tanks, side tanks, and various other places. Now, because the aircraft doesn't have, has a swing wing, it doesn't have ailerons. Now, ailerons are what aircraft normally use to turn. So this one, the horizontal stabiliser at the back, has to do both jobs of the elevators, which normally used for climb descent, and ailerons are used for turning. They work asymmetrically. So these horizontal stabilisers, they're 156 square feet, all on that one pin. You imagine when you go and supersonic the pressure on them. And they have to work symmetrically for climbing and descending, and asymmetrically for turning, and both asymmetrically and symmetrically at the same time. So that's an unusual feature. We have various sensors on the aircraft, electronic countermeasures, missile approach warning systems, radar homing and warning systems. So these are all systems to detect missiles or radars painting on you and steering missiles at you. And then underneath here we can dispense flares. So if you detect a heat-seeking missile coming, you can dispense flares that will drop away, explode at a higher temperature than the engine, and the heat-seeking missile hopefully will follow it. Otherwise, there's chaff in there as well. Chaff was around in World War II. It's just aluminium strips. So you've got a cassette about that big. It drops away, explodes, 10,000 strips of aluminium to confuse radar and that sort of stuff. You might have seen at air shows on TV or at air shows in person, they have this procedure they call a dump and burn, and that's where they dump their fuel. Not liked by a lot of aircrew, but the crowds like it, so they do it. They dump fuel from this port. Even jumbo jets dump fuel. If they take, of course, they can take off heavier than they can land safely for the undercarriage. They dump the fuel out of this point here, and when they light the reheat section of the engine called afterburner, as the fuel is being ejected, it starts to burn and you get a 70 to 80 foot flame. Now this contraption here underneath is called a pave tack. Now when we got these in 1973, this is the internal weapons bay, but rarely are weapons carried there. The weapons are normally carried on pylons under the wings, which we don't have any on right now. When we first got it, we had a 6-barrel Gatling gun in there, 6,000 rounds a minute, 20 millimetre. It would come down on the cage when you wanted it and go back into the bay where there was also an ammunition bin when it's not in use, so you don't have drag. When this technology became available, it's called a pave tack. It's a forward-looking infrared and laser guidance system. And again, that's in the display position. That bear's head-looking thing should be facing down when it's in use, and it can pivot back and forward, you can see from the rings around it. And when not in use, that rolls back in and all you'd see was the little bump, so it's not creating drag. You can highlight the target with forward-looking infrared and lay a laser beam and drop laser-guided bombs. So it's quite an advancement, because it was really too big and bulky for it to be a fighter. Even though it's called a fighter bomber, it's really a bomber. Now that is a capsule that was used in an ejection. I think it's the one that they were still on the ground when they ejected. The ejection parameters are 0-50, 0 altitude, 50 knots. I believe they were at 90 knots at the end of the runway when they ejected. So the whole capsule ejects, okay? 27,000 pound rocket motor. It's got 2 nozzles, one facing vertically and one facing aft. And the computers work out with the speed and altitude which nozzle most of the power will go through. Obviously, if you're at 35,000 feet going twice the speed of sound, you don't want the vertical nozzle getting all the power, you just flip over. So that's what it's designed for. 2 ejection handles, but whoever pulls the handle, you both go. As soon as the capsule separates, an impact attenuation bag inflates underneath the capsule, and that's about that large. And it's made up of many chambers of air, and that's designed because this is heavy, and when you land, it's going to be heavy. So that impact attenuation bag, it deflates at a predetermined rate as you land to break the force of the landing. But it's still, a couple of the chaps I know who have ejected said, you ejected about 15 Gs and landed about 20, and you black out for a few seconds. So it is a heavy landing, okay? If you're on the ground and you eject, the rocket motor should take you up to about 800 feet. Then the main parachute deploys and down you come, okay? If you're at altitude, when you eject, you don't want the main chute coming out immediately because it'd tear itself to pieces. So there's a little drogue chute that comes out. This is designed aerodynamically. It's got a stabilizer pin there. So you eject, and a drogue chute just keeps it steady and it descends to a lower speed. And this here is the barostatic lock. That's a pressure altimeter lock, okay? So when you pass 15,000, the main chute should open and then bring you down, okay, rather than opening at 35,000 and tearing itself to pieces. Now, if it doesn't, what do? I mean, you're sitting there, you've ejected, and you're probably having a chat because you've got nothing else to do, picking up the kids after school maybe, going for a beer. Then the standby altimeter is still working. So then you notice you pass 15,000 and the chute hasn't opened. So what to do? Don't worry, you can do it yourself, okay? There's a backup. So it's a very good system, and as I said, there's a couple of people I've spoken to who have survived the ejection quite well. Anything else we've got here? As I say, terrain following radar, a switch there. The other interesting thing here, now I got out after I was on them a couple of years, so over the next 20 years, 25 plus, they probably introduced new procedures, but when I was on them, that seat over there where I sat is as a navigator weapon systems officer. You've still got a control column and throttles, okay? So all we were taught is that in case the pilot got taken out, your low level, the birds were a big problem, okay? If he got taken out by a bird, or he got shot or had a heart attack, all we were trained to do was to recover the aircraft, get it to a safe area and height for ejection, okay? Not to land it. Now, whether that changed later as they advanced over the 37 years, I don't know. But that's all we were trained to do. The reason it has two control columns is, we were told that in America, where we trained, was it was originally designed for two pilots. So they get a pilot who'd been on pilot's course for 12 months, and they say, you're going to sit in that right-hand seat for 12 months and before you can fly in the left-hand seat. Now over there's a lot of equipment. There's electronic countermeasures, there's bombing systems, there's radar systems, there's navigation systems. An awful lot to learn. Now these guys have just spent 12 months learning to fly. They're not interested in learning all that stuff. All they want to do is sit over here or fly it. So that wasn't working, so they took them out, put navigators in and called them weapon systems officers. And that's the course I did in America, was called that at Nellis Air Force Base. So I'm very pleased that happened because I got to sit there. But they left the control columns and the throttles and all that. So what we do normally to practice those unusual attitudes was after the last part of an exercise, we'd drop bombs at Evans Head Range. Then on our way back to Embley Air Force Base, we'd book 4,000 foot of airspace, normally 20 to 24,000 with rhythm control. Then the pilot would say to me, pull your visors down, close your eyes, and he'd turn it upside down and point it to the ground and say, recover. And there were standard recovery procedures, which even people in light aircraft would know. Stick full forward and centered, rudder's neutral. And then if it's upside down, you flip it up the right way and you fly to a safe area at altitude for ejection. So that was about it. So a beautiful aircraft. When you consider that I'd previously been on the Neptune you saw out there, then the Canberra, and then, well, this was the Rolls-Royce, obviously. So it was quite a remarkable thing to be involved in. Okay, I think that's about it. As I say, following the terrain was often a problem. When the pilots I flew with had flown Mirages, Sabres, Mirages, then F-4 Phantoms. And for them to sit there, not touching this control yoke, a lot of them got twitchy because they're used to controlling the aircraft. But at 200 feet, as I say, 1,100 kilometres an hour, and they're not allowed to touch that. So they get a bit fidgety sometimes. So it was a bit of a change of the whole philosophy of flying for them. A remarkable aircraft.